Skeletons, 2 centuries old, unearthed from sailors' graveyards. They are the forgotten crewmen that make the ships they fight in the stuff of legend. Now, seagoing warriors are finally giving up their secrets to forensic science. Extraordinary stories of courage and suffering, terror and glory. In the carnage of battle, one giant shadow hangs over these men. Who will live and who will die? The Navy of the Damned is coming back from the dead. Imagine these skeletons 2 centuries ago. Living warriors on their floating world. Our ship of bones. It's the most devastating weapon of the age. A 100-gun battleship of the British Navy. One broadside from its 100 guns can destroy an enemy ship in a matter of minutes. But it is the men packed on board who deliver that terrifying power. To do so, they must live in constant danger from disease and horrific injury. In conditions that push the human spirit to the limit. The dark secrets of the sailors' lives can only be told from the legacy of their bones.
The first thing we noticed was the very small size of this individual's bones.
So we thought this may be the remains of a small child. When we measured the bones and looked at the development of his teeth, we found that he was between 11 and 13 years of age when he died. It's obviously quite an emotional experience when you find a young child in a cemetery like this, and it's apparent that he would have had quite a difficult life and obviously died at a very young age.
It's a shocking discovery. A young boy caught up in the horror of the ship of bones. More forensic tests set out to tell the story of his short life in as much detail as possible. Measuring the chemicals in his skeleton is the first step.
He was quite short for his age, and the low nitrogen levels would indicate that he would have had little protein while he was growing up, so perhaps he came from quite a deprived background or quite a poor background and was malnourished when he was quite young.
But why is a boy on the ship of bones?
Boys as young as 11 could end up in the Navy for a number of reasons. Some were sent here by magistrates for having committed crime. This was the only option that they were given. They had to come.
Amazingly, for a deprived child, the ship of bones offers hope.
It gave them the opportunity to forge a career. They might have been destitute orphans from the street, and this gave them a chance to make something of themselves, and also a good chance at survival.
Nearly 1 in 10 of the ship of bones crew are young boys.
You could expect to find between 40 and 60 boys at any given time. Some of those would be here to be trained as officers, and others would be here to be trained as sailors. And they would work amongst the able seamen and the ordinary seamen and learn their trade, learn the ropes from these men.
The enemy is sighted. The ship prepares for action. No mercy is shown the boy. Despite his age, he's thrust into the heat of battle. Charged with the vital job of carrying the gunpowder. The powder monkey.
It was a very dangerous job, and it was usually fulfilled by these boys because they were small, they were agile, and they could maneuver quickly through the bows of a ship.
The boy powder monkey is about to enter hell. The gun deck during battle is a living nightmare of noise and fury. The shockwaves alone burst eardrums. But the powder monkey's remains suggest an even bloodier trauma. The bottom of his left leg is completely missing.
So here is his tibia. You can see there's an amputation just below the knee. You can see there the saw marks and where it actually was just amputated. Perhaps this was preceded by some kind of trauma, some kind of accident, or involving maybe his lower foot or lower leg.
As guns blaze, the boy on the gun deck is in mortal danger. Here is the damage even a small cannon can unleash, revealing the menace that stalks the boy as he runs amongst the guns.
This is the damage that a 3-pound cannonball can do to a solid oak target, fired with quite a small charge of gunpowder. We've hit the target. This shows the energy in just a 3-pounder projectile, punching the hole through. Coming around the back of the target, instead of the neat hole, for example, the top hole, we've got a lot of splintering here, jagged splinters. Then here there's similar splintering from another shot. And they're not all splinters of this size. For example, there's a piece here, this is the outside, here's a bit of the black powder fouling where the cannonballs hit the outside of the target, and then shattered this side, and a piece of wood like this would be flying around the gun deck, maybe hitting you with the sharp end, the jagged end, or even sideways.
The cannonballs striking the boy's gun deck weigh over 13 kilograms, with many times more impact force, creating a deadly hail of splinters. The evidence of the boy's bones is compelling.
Most of the injuries on board were caused by splinters, which were as a result of a round shot punching its way through the ship's side. This would cause a huge shower of really long and sharp splinters that would pierce a leg, leaving the ship surgeon no option but to remove the leg in an amputation process.
Dragged to the surgeon's table, his fight for life has just begun. "30 meters above the wounded boy, one of his crewmates is facing his own dangers as the battle intensifies.
When we excavated this individual, we noticed he had quite a number of severe fractures in his body, and this totaled 9 fractures. The fractures are found in his hands, his arm, up to his skull, and also in his femur.
These shocking injuries demand answers. The first clue could be the man's physique.
Well, this individual was quite short. He was probably only about 5'5" or 5'6" in height. And from looking at his bones also, we can see the areas of muscle attachment. This may have been quite wiry, quite a small person. He may have worked possibly in the rigging or climbing a lot on board the ship.
Out on the swaying masts for hours at a time, exposed to the elements, hands torn by rope and canvas, are the top men, bones death-defying elite. The top man's life depends on speed and strength, never more so than in the heat of the action.
On board ship, the topmen regarded themselves as the aristocrats of the lower deck, the most skilled men. They've got to be accustomed to moving about aloft in the rigging, in all weathers, in daylight or in darkness, in cold or in heat, moving fast and accurately with a combination of strength and agility.
Despite the extreme conditions, the top men do not wear a harness.
The catchphrase for topmen was always one hand for yourself and one hand for the ship. One hand to work, one hand to hang on. But actually, a lot of the time, you need both hands to work, and you've just got to make the best of hanging on without your hands.
Even with years of experience, something goes horribly wrong for the top man.
His wrist bones are shattered. He's also broken his radius, a bone in his forearm, and moving upwards, he broke his elbow. So his elbow joint is completely shattered, and also his upper arm, his humerus. Moving up to his skull, he broke his cheekbone, and he's also broken his jawbone in 3 places.
It's a nightmare fall. But what knocks the master of the masts to his fate? The Ship of Bones is in an intense firefight. The top man, working the sails, over 30 meters up, now faces his greatest danger. The enemy is deliberately targeting the mast. Destroy the rigging, and the ship becomes a sitting duck. To unleash maximum chaos, the enemy guns are loaded with special ammunition called bar shot.
We have 2 examples of bar shot here. This would be loaded into the weapon, and when it was fired, it would start to tumble through the air and was very effective at bringing down the masts and the yards. Also, we have here chain shot, 2 24-pound round shots. They're connected with a piece of chain, very effective at bringing down the sails and the rigging.
A direct hit is possibly the hidden factor in deciding the top man's destiny.
The man who fell from the mast suffered a high-energy, high-velocity impact. It would have been the equivalent of jumping, say, from a 2nd or 3rd floor building. Or indeed, coming off a motorbike and hitting a wall at about 50 miles an hour.
The top man's multiple fractures tell their own gruesome blow-by-blow account.
As the sailor fell from the mast and he landed, the first thing that he used to try and break his impact with his arms, so he put his arms outstretched like that. He's got fractures to both small bones in his hand, which would have been the forced pushing back, the scaphoid bone. He's got fractures of his wrist, he's got fractures of the humerus. So as the force travelled up his arm, things broke in succession.
Hitting the deck, his jaw is dislocated with such force it's driven up into his skull, breaking it in 3 places. By some miracle, the fall doesn't kill him. Signs of healing prove he survived. His body broken, somehow he clings to life. For now. Such devastating injuries incurred in battle create a constant demand for new crew. The fate of this man reveals just how ruthlessly the Ship of Bones meets that need. Chemical analysis on each skeleton can determine the men's place of birth. The body intrigues the experts.
This skeleton turned out to be particularly interesting because he shows a diet which included plants such as maize or sugarcane from hotter countries, which is consistent with people from the east coast of America.
But why is an American on the Ship of Bones? A clue to his fate comes from the diary of a known American sailor. In 1810, a 17-year-old Joseph Bates from Massachusetts, staying in the English port of Liverpool, is in for a shock.
A press gang asked to which country we belonged. We produced our American protections, which proved us to be citizens of the United States. These nor our arguments would satisfy them. They seized and dragged us to the rendezvous. In the morning, we were examined and ordered to join the British Navy. Seaman Joseph Bates.
The end of the Revolutionary War in 1783 sees Americans exempt from British press gangs. But not, it seems, this American. The American's bones may reveal why he's such a desirable asset.
When we examined the skeleton, we noticed that he was a very robust individual. He had well-developed muscles, particularly of his upper body. This is not very surprising in sailors, given that a lot of their time was spent in activities such as hauling on ropes, but also gunnery practice was a very strenuous activity.
Well-trained gunnery is the Ship of Bones' deadliest weapon.
You've got to practice, you've got to endlessly practice, so that even the least skilled people in the ship's company know what they've got to do, know it backwards, so they'll be able to do it in darkness, in terror, under fire, without needing to think about it.
The American has been press-ganged into the power struggle between Britain and France for control of the world's oceans. For the press-ganged American, the floating world of the Ship of Bones is effectively a prison. But for one of his crewmates, the same ship may be his one chance of freedom. He's of average height for the time, 1 meter 52 centimeters. Unusual features of his skull attract the archaeologist's attention.
What was particularly interesting about him is when we looked at his skull, when we look at the face shape, the shape of his nose, his eye sockets, and the general shape of his skull, it's very consistent with somebody of African ancestry, from West Africa or from the West Indies.
Further tests on the chemical makeup of his bones also indicate he started life in a hot climate. His whole physique shows the signs of hard labor.
When we look at the humerus, we see ridging on the bones that would indicate that he had well-developed chest muscles and also upper arm muscles. Similarly, there's ridging on the leg bones like the femur that would indicate that he had well-developed leg muscles as well. So the general impression is one of a not very tall individual, but a stocky, well-muscled one.
Most likely, this man was a slave on a Caribbean plantation. His path to freedom, a warship. He's welcome on the Ship of Bones, where back-breaking jobs, like raising the anchor, need raw strength. The men are dependent on each other. Race means little, particularly when battle looms. On the Ship of Bones gun deck, the press-ganged American is about to turn his training into practice.
The favoured British fighting tactic was to hold your fire until the last possible moment, to get very close to the enemy, and then to open a devastating volume of fire as fast as possible to smash the enemy and knock him out very quickly.
Like heavyweight boxers, toe to toe, the warships pound each other till a lethal knockout decides the contest. It seems the American escapes unharmed. Then the archaeologists look closer.
Well, when we looked at the feet, we noticed that the tip of the big toe on the right side was very short and very flattened. From that, we concluded that he'd suffered a crush fracture.
A 3-ton gun has a fearsome kickback. Its blast and noise is so loud, it stuns even the most experienced sailors. Yet in spite of the risks, many sailors go barefoot. One tiny lapse of concentration. And the American gunner is brought down. His crushed toe is agony, but it won't kill the American. A detailed inspection of his remains points the archaeologists in a different direction.
When we looked at the skeleton more closely, we noticed that there was a very fine layer of new bone that had been deposited over many of the bones of the body. It can be attributed to a number of causes, but given the historical background, it's highly likely that this individual had suffered from scurvy.
Scurvy is caused by a poor diet, a lack of vitamin C in particular.
The gums become spongy and gum tissue protrudes from the mouth where it immediately rots and stinks horribly. You can have black skin, your joints swell. It also had the strangest mental effects. People became very melancholy and their senses were heightened. There are reports of men dying simply from the sound of a gunshot, or screaming in agony when they smelt flowers and fruit. So very bizarre.
As scurvy grips him, the American's body begins to tear apart. Fresh wounds stop healing, and old scars reopen and bleed out. The curse of scurvy will one day be eradicated from the Navy by a simple daily dose of lemon juice. But that breakthrough comes too late to save the American. He never makes it home, dying before he reaches 40. As battle rages all around, the ship's surgeon fights to save the boy powder monkey's life. His leg ripped apart by shrapnel.
I can scarcely imagine what it must have been like to be trying to work in the bowels of a ship in dim lighting, moving with gunshots going on around me. Of course, patients didn't have any form of painkillers, so they'd have been screaming and writhing around. You had to get assistants to hold patients down.
The boy's only hope is for his leg to be amputated as fast as possible.
We held him while the surgeon cut his leg off above the knee. The task was most painful to behold. The surgeon using his knife and saw on human flesh and bones, as freely as the butcher at the shambles does on the carcass of the beast. Ordinary seaman Samuel Leach.
Some of the records for amputations in those days are incredible. There was a surgeon called Liston who was reputed to be able to amputate a leg from start to finish in 2.5 minutes.
Signs of infection around the stump show. The surgeon's speed isn't matched by his cleanliness.
Until the late 18th century, it was a badge of honour for a surgeon to carry blood and muck around on his clothing. In fact, the more blood you had, the bigger and better surgeon you were. They didn't care if they transferred pus, gangrene bacteria, contents of bowel, abscesses, anything. They didn't know what caused infections, and unfortunately in those days, ignorance was not bliss.
Somehow, the boy survives his amputation, but his fight for life isn't over yet. As the young boy fights back against the infection raging through his body, the intensity of naval warfare brings another sailor into the firing line. Wounds on this skeleton point to a man set apart from the rest of the crew.
What I found so remarkable in the skeleton was when we examined the jaw. When we look at the normal side, we see a nice square angle. When we look at the other side, the angle of the jaw has become very reduced in size and very abnormally shaped.
The savage cut wound suggests something special.
This injury would have been caused by a vertical slash, probably by a heavy blade like a cutlass or sword, and this would be a vertical slicing down the face, cutting through his cheekbone and cutting right through into his jaw.
The blade cut injury points to close quarter fighting. The most likely candidate is a Marine, the Navy SEAL of his age. The Marines leave the Ship of Bones on a stealth raid. The objective? To sabotage the enemy and put them out of action before they can join battle. Under the nose of the enemy, the raiders jam the guns with steel pins. And set charges that will cripple the enemy vessel. But away from their mothership, they're terribly exposed. At any moment, they can be discovered. From the angle and severity of the cut mark, the cutlass blow can be pieced together.
The sailor who sustained the injury to his face would have had a blow across here that would have gone through skin, muscle. It would have divided the facial nerve, when the facial nerve is cut, that this side of the face droops, patients dribble, they can't talk properly, and it's a very disfiguring injury indeed.
The blade cleaves off the lower section of the Marine's jaw. His life is hanging in the balance. The daring raids and sea battles have all taken their toll on the men of the Ship of Bones. But even when it does return to port, new dangers face its crew. Unscathed by battle, the slave sailor fighting.
When we look more closely at the rib cage, we notice on the right side a thickening of the shaft and quite a clear line. And this is a fracture of the rib. And we see quite extensive healing, so this happened a while before he died. Another broken bone we found were the bones of his nose. If you look here, you'll see that the bones are actually displaced and actually bent inwards. And this is from fractures of the nasal bones. This injury is most commonly associated with interpersonal violence, with being punched in the face.
Pictures from the time vividly illustrate the role of bare-knuckle fighting on a warship.
This is published by Thomas Tegg in the early 19th century. It's a very highly coloured image of life on the lower deck. But it can also tell us a good deal about naval life too. The scene that it depicts shows a warship in harbour, which was a time where naval discipline could be somewhat slackened. I think what we can see is this was a very closely knit community, and also one physically confined within a very tight space. There are a great many activities that we can see here, from drinking and carousing through to fighting.
The punch of an experienced boxer has an impact force of as much as 3.5 tons. A direct hit instantly shatters the nose. With no gloves to cushion the force, the slave sailor's rib is equally vulnerable. Also on the lower decks, another man is letting off steam, but risking his life to hidden and lethal dangers.
On initial inspection, there wasn't anything too extraordinary about the skeleton. He wasn't very tall and he wasn't very well built. However, when we look at his lower legs, we found these lesions and they're really remarkable and very unusual. This is the lower leg bone, or shin bone, the tibia, and all along the length of this bone are these cave-like erosions or little lesions.
Strange pockmarks covering his skeleton catch the archaeologist's attention.
And as we move up the skeleton, we find similar lesions in the arm. As you can see here, again, more of these erosions and holes into the bone. Now moving on to the skull. On the front of the skull, we have this worm-eaten appearance, similar to the rest of the bones in the skeleton. All of these lesions lead us to believe this person suffered from syphilis.
Even in port, the men are rarely allowed off the Ship of Bones. It is their only world. Such confinement brings risks.
If you let them go ashore, they'll head straight for the pubs and the brothels. If you don't let them go ashore because you're afraid they'll desert, the best thing is not to inquire too closely as to what kind of visitors are coming on board the ship. In other words, if you don't let the sailors go to the drink and the women, then at least you'll allow the drink and the women to come to the sailors, and you definitely don't go snooping around in the dark corners of the lower deck, because whatever's going on, it's not going to be a vicarage tea party.
The tendency of this practice is to render a ship of war while in port a continual scene of riot and disorder, of obscenity and blasphemy, of drunkenness, lewdness and debauchery. Captain Edward Hawker.
It was the standard practice that prostitutes be rowed out to the fleet, and often these prostitutes were infected with syphilis. Of course, they in turn might have been victims, they might have been infected by seamen. The other difficulty is that a seaman would have had to have paid to be cured, and the fee was 15 shillings, would be docked from a seaman's wages. So there was no incentive to explain that he contracted this disease.
A moment's pleasure is about to turn to a life of agony. About a month after infection, lesions appear. With no known cure, the disease is rampant in the fleet.
By the mid-19th century, there was a huge loss of manpower. Contagious Diseases Act was passed in the 1860s, which meant that any prostitute could be stopped and examined forcibly. And if she was found to have the disease, she could be put in a lock hospital until she was cured.
The Navy's attempt at disease control comes too late for the syphilitic sailor. 10 weeks after contracting the disease, he suffers fevers, headaches, and hair loss. Soon after, the soft tissue of his nose and lips are eaten away. The scars on the bones testify to a grim conclusion.
Because of all the involvement throughout his bones, his lower legs and his arm and his skull, we can say that this is probably tertiary stage syphilis.
Tertiary syphilis is a harrowing disease. As the infection attacks his nervous system and brain, the sailor suffers seizures and shocking personality changes.
Seamen who did have tertiary syphilis would simply have been unfit for service in the Navy. They would have experienced truly horrible symptoms. Their body would have been totally out of control.
What are you laughing at?
Mad with syphilis, the sailor ends up in the asylum wing of a naval hospital. Locked in cold, dark cells, beaten, doused with water, denied hot food, often forcibly restrained. Treatment is as bad as the disorder. His brain slowly destroyed, the sailor finally sinks into a paralytic state. He dies around the age of 50. Death is now stalking the ship of bones. The top man who plunged from the rigging is still fighting for his life.
have your jaw pushed upwards with that degree of force would certainly have given him a significant head injury. If he was unlucky, he'd have been conscious through much of what followed, but I suspect that he probably had a bleed inside his head and was probably comatose for a lot of what went on. He'd have had great difficulty getting fluids or food inside, and was probably fed through some kind of primitive tube which went down his throat.
After weeks of excruciating agony, death finally spares him from more suffering. The boy powder monkey, too, is somehow hanging on. After the amputation of his lower leg, his bone began to heal.
Around the stump of his leg, there's evidence of healing and evidence of infection. So it's possible he lived for maybe a month after the amputation occurred.
But infection of his wound during surgery has sealed his fate. The boy powder monkey dies by the age of 13. But not all the injured sailors succumb to their wounds. Incredibly, the Marine survives.
And the reason he survived and the others didn't was because of the nature of the wound. He didn't have any major blood vessels cut, so he wasn't going to die of blood loss, and he didn't have anything which was going to get horribly infected. And the reason for that is because the face has a particularly good blood supply. Facial injuries heal beautifully and often without infection.
Despite the horrific damage to his jaw, the bone heals and the disfigured Marine lives out his days, a pensioner in a naval hospital. For the slave sailor, the outcome is better still. After 1772, any slave who sets foot in England, by law, is given back his liberty. With his remains unearthed in a sailor's cemetery, it seems the slave sailor died a free man. But, alongside the trophy scars of his bare-knuckle boxing, his leg bone shows that freedom comes at a price. These skeletons from the Ship of Bones are an extraordinary insight into life and death on a warship 2 centuries ago. The strength, coordination, agility, stealth, suffering, the raw courage of a child.
The battle went on. Our men fought like tigers, like heroes. I have often been asked what were my feelings during this fight. I felt pretty much as I suppose everyone does at such a time. That men are without thought when they stand amid the dying and the dead. Seaman Samuel Leach.
In May 2011, the sailors' remains unearthed in the south of England were buried again with honours. The sacrifice they made in defence of their country, no longer forgotten.